In this video, I want to introduce and briefly explain to you four categories that describe how people think about themselves and the world differently. Each category consists of two opposite approaches that shape how people think. Whichever approach characterizes a person may depend on the society or community that shapes that person's identity. We will broadly classify two major cultural types as Western and non-Western, acknowledging that such broad generalizations do not work well in reality, as there may be minority groups who do not fit the stereotype. They do, however, help us to identify the major trends in societies. The four categories of identity that we will look at are individualism versus collectivism, either or versus both and, concrete versus abstract, and field dependence versus independence. As you listen to a description of each type, try to think of the educational applications that can be made for each category. We will discuss this topic further in our class together, so it will be helpful for you to take notes while you listen and then reflect further so that you can contribute to our discussion in class and perhaps speak about your own cultural background in relation to these categories. The first category of difference that we will look at is individualism versus collectivism. In general, people in non-Western societies think in relational, functional categories. For example, if you ask someone from a non-Western background to describe a person, they might do it in this way. So let's say that this is Ahmed, and we ask someone from a non-Western culture to describe Ahmed. They might describe him in this way. He is from a large family. He is married and he has 2 children. He is the cousin of the mayor, and his best friend's name is Saleh. We see that each of these descriptions are not about Ahmad's intrinsic features or characteristics, but about his relationships with people. In contrast to this type of description, a person from a Western cultural background may describe someone in this way. So let's say that his name is John, and someone from a Western cultural background would describe John in the following way. So John is a successful businessman. He lives in a large house. He is quite tall, and he has won many sports awards in college. We see that these descriptions are not about John's relationships with people, but about his intrinsic characteristics such as being tall and his achievements such as being a successful businessman, living in a big house, and having won many sports awards. We can see evidence of this individualistic perception of the person as far back as ancient Greek mythology, which was based on the individual personalities and attributes of the gods of the Greek pantheon. The individual strengths and attributes of each god was emphasized. For example, Zeus was the god of the sky and weather, and that was unique to him. Poseidon was the god of the sea, and he had his own set of attributes and personality characteristics. Apollo was the god of music and prophecy, and so the uniqueness of each of these gods was emphasized. Another example of individualism is Augustine's Confessions, which was a product of Greek introspection and interest in the personal biography of people's lives. Augustine, with his publication of his personal life journey in the Confessions, is sometimes credited with popularizing biographical introspection, which has had a shaping influence on Western culture. In opposition to the Western emphasis on introspection and personal biography, Confucian philosophy, which was dominant in East Asia, emphasized social relationships above individual interests and personality. In Confucian societies, the family, community, and society are more important than the individual. To put it another way, in these societies, the sum of all parts is more important than each individual part. The community has been around for longer and will continue to exist after the individual. Therefore, the well-being and longevity of the community takes precedence over the individual. It has been observed in Western countries that the reading books used in early school years depicts characters in an individualistic manner. For example, when I was in grade 1 and 2 in South Africa, which at the time was a country whose educational system was closely modeled on British education, we used a reading book called Janet and Mark. The book would feature sentences such as, "See Mark run," "See Janet play," and "See the dog jump." We can see that each of these sentences are describing the individual actions of the different characters. In contrast to this, a similar reading exercise book for Chinese children shows a little boy sitting on the shoulders of a bigger boy. The book features sentences such as, "Big brother takes care of little brother," "Big brother loves little brother loves big brother." Here it is not individual actions, but relationships between people that seem important to emphasize in children's reading books. An example of the difference over emphasis on relational versus intrinsic characteristics can be seen in the research of Alexander Luria, a Russian psychologist who conducted a test of logical association among the Kyrgyz people of Central Asia. He showed them a picture of a group of 4 people featuring 3 adults and 1 child. They were then asked which one of the 4 did not belong to the group. When most people from a Western cultural background are asked this question, they will say that the child does not belong to the group, because the child is not an adult, and adulthood seems to be the major criterion for selection in the group. However, the Kyrgyz said that the first person is the father, the second person is the mother, and they need a child, so this child is part of their family. The third adult could be an uncle, and he is not necessary for this family, so the uncle can be eliminated. In a similar example, Luria showed his research participants a picture of a set of tools including an axe, a log, a hammer, and a saw. When this picture is shown to Westerners, they would usually eliminate the log because it is not a tool. The Kyrgyz, however, argued that with a log they could make a fire if they had an axe or a saw. One person said, "The saw will cut the log and the axe will chop it into small pieces." When Luria suggested that the hammer, saw, and axe were tools and so belonged together, another Kyrgyz said, "Yes, but even if we have tools, we still need wood. Otherwise, we cannot build anything. Moreover, the hammer is useless because there are no nails, so the hammer can be eliminated." And so we can see that their choice is based on the relationship between the objects and not on the individual characteristics of the objects themselves. The second category that we will consider is the difference between either or versus both and thinking. According to Aristotelian logic, which has shaped the way people think in Western societies, the law of non-contradiction states that A equals to A, B equals to B, but A cannot be equal to B, and B cannot be equal to A. This type of logic has influenced Western education and has led to the compartmentalization of subject disciplines, such as math, physics, history, biology, geography, languages, and literature. Each of these subjects are taught separately, and there is no relation between these subjects. No connections are made when these subjects are studied separately. Also, in different types of knowledge domains, there's also separation, for example, between science and faith, rationalism and mysticism, naturalism and supernaturalism. These are all separate domains and are not compatible, so therefore they are seen as contradictory. Another manifestation of either or thinking in the West is the popularity of debate in education and also in politics. Debate is used as a form of reasoning with the purpose of arriving at the most logical and correct viewpoint about a particular topic. Whichever side of the debate presents the least contradictions and weaknesses in their argument will inevitably be the side that wins. Consider as an example the election process in the United States, in which debate is a central feature between the candidates. This process contrasts with traditions in non-Western societies where leadership selection is not based on competition to discover whose ideas are the best, but is based on a process of consensus so that to make decisions and choose leaders. Let's have a look at the two following sets of proverbs. It could be predicted that whichever set you prefer will reveal your tolerance or intolerance for contradictions. The first set of proverbs says, half a loaf is better than none. One against all is certain to fall. For example is no proof. In the second set, the proverbs say, too humble is half proud. Beware of your friends, not your enemies. A man is stronger than iron and weaker than a fly. In the first set of proverbs, none of the proverbs have any contradictions. In the second set, all three have contradictions. Researchers found that the second type of proverbs were more common in a Chinese collection of proverbs than in an American collection. So we can categorize these as being more Asian and these as being more Western. When students at the University of Michigan and Beijing University were asked to rate how much they liked the proverbs, the Chinese students had a preference for the proverbs with contradictions, while the American students had a preference for proverbs without any contradictions. Similarly, a review of some of the major theological divisions and controversies that have occurred in Western church history happened partly as a result of non-contradictory thinking. For example, in debates about Christology, people argued over the deity of Christ versus the humanity of Christ. It was difficult for them to accept how these two concepts could be compatible. The same with the Christ of Kerygma, the Christ who was preached by the church after the resurrection, and the Christ of the Gospels who some claim was different in reality from the type of Christ that was preached by the church later on. And so there was an incompatibility. In soteriology, the debate was between faith and reason, grace and work, or evangelism for conversion, or social gospel as witness. All of these different concepts was found to be very difficult to be compatible, and so debates and controversies rose up between these concepts. Another factor that distinguishes between ways of thinking based on cultural differences is the notion of concrete versus abstract thinking. People who think concretely process information on the basis of what can be seen, heard, felt, and tasted. For example, a concrete thinker who looks at the Statue of Liberty only sees it as a statue of a woman carrying a torch. They will see its physical characteristics. So there's a woman and there's a torch. The focus is therefore on the aesthetic qualities of the object. When presented with an idea that appears abstract, concrete thinkers need concrete examples to make sense of the idea. For example, in John 15:13 it says, "Love is when a friend lays his life down for another." The example of someone dying in the place of another person provides a concrete illustration of what the abstract idea of love means. On the other hand, abstract thinkers tend to draw abstractions from examples instead of the other way around. An abstract thinker who looks at the Statue of Liberty will associate with it the ideas of freedom and liberty, two abstract ideas. Abstract thinkers do not require an example of an idea to help them better understand its meaning. For example, in 1 Corinthians 13, love is described using abstractions such as patience, kindness, selflessness. This is okay for abstract thinkers. They will not need a specific example to understand what love is said here to be. While the use of abstract ideas was common in Greek philosophy, Chinese philosophy was more concrete. This can also be seen by analyzing the Chinese language. Here we can see these Chinese characters are based on concrete images from nature. For example, there is no word for size in Chinese. This word presents too much of an abstraction without an immediate connection to sense perception. When buying a pair of shoes, instead of the store assistant asking for the size of your feet, the store assistant will instead ask you for the big, small of your feet. A very concrete idea. There are also no suffixes, such as the English ness, such as we see in the word sweetness, tiredness, and hardness. The suffix ness generalizes these concepts and makes them abstract. In Chinese, therefore, there is no word such as whiteness. This is too abstract. Instead, people will say the white of the swan or the white of the snow when comparing a color. Another example can be seen in the Chinese character representing the idea of righteousness. The Chinese character is composed of two smaller characters, the one meaning lamb, set over the other character meaning me. Here we can see how these two are combined. Lamb and me. A very concrete image of righteousness. The final category we will look at is field dependence versus field independence. This refers to the degree to which perception of an object is influenced by the background or environment in which it appears. To test field dependence, researchers created the rod and frame test. In this test, participants are asked to look into a long box. At the end of the box is a rod with a frame around it. The rod and frame can be tilted independently of each other, and the participant's task is to indicate when the rod is completely vertical. Participants who find it difficult to position the rod vertically because of the visual interference of the frame are considered field dependent because they depend on the orientation of the frame to judge if the rod is vertical. Another test used to determine field dependence or independence is the embedded figures test. In this test, the objective is to locate a simple figure that is embedded in a much more complex figure. We can see that this simple figure can be found here. The longer it takes people to find the simple figure in its complicated context, the more field dependent they are assumed to be. So in this example, participants should locate this ball in this complex figure, this shape in here. Research has concluded that being field dependent or independent depends to a large degree on one's social environment and the kinds of social constraints that one experiences. To get to this conclusion, researchers examined the field dependence of Orthodox Jewish boys who, they argued, lived in families and communities where role relations are strictly defined and where there are many social restraints. These communities can be regarded as collectivistic. The performance of the Orthodox boys was compared to that of secular Jewish boys who were perceived to be less subject to strict social controls. The final group of participants were Protestant boys, who were believed to be exposed to even looser social constraints. they can be said to come from individualistic communities. It was found that the Orthodox boys from collectivistic communities were the most field dependent, and the Protestant boys were the most field independent, with the secular Jewish boys between the two extreme groups. So if we made a scale, this is what it would look like. So on this side would be field dependent, and this side would be independent. So the Orthodox Jewish boys would be on the far extreme of the scale, the Protestant boys would be on this extreme, and the secular Jewish boys would be about in the middle. It is also said that field-dependent people perform better when working with other people, while field-independent people prefer working alone. So these are dependent and these are independent. We have looked at 4 categories that describes how people perceive themselves and others differently. The way people prefer to learn is also determined to a certain extent on which polarity they most identify with. As I said earlier, it is not safe to simply generalize that everyone in either Western or non-Western cultures think according to these stereotypes. But these general descriptions do describe how the majority of people in these societies think. Remember to come to the class prepared to engage in discussion of this topic. You may also do further online research and bring some of the ideas you discovered to class to contribute to our discussion. Thank you.